Hey, friend, welcome to the Renaissance English History Podcast, a part of the Agora Podcast Network and the original Tudor History Podcast, telling stories of the 16th century since 2009. I am your host, Heather. I am delighted that you are here with me. Today, we are going to talk about what the Tudors knew about an early piece of their history, the Vikings and the Viking invasions and Alfred the Great and all of that kind of thing. I've been rewatching The Last Kingdom the past couple of weeks. I love those books. Uhtred of Bebbanburg. Fun fact, I actually went to Bamborough Castle, which is what Bebbanburg is based on. A couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I went with a friend, and what was so funny was the bottom gate was actually open, and, so we just drove right in, but then, like, some man came out yelling at us, telling us it was closed and, we had to leave, and so then we were like, "Yeah, the gate's open down there." So it's quite funny because I actually, similarly to Uhtred, I infiltrated and got into Bebbanburg Castle without them knowing it, as it were. I felt like an invader. Was quite fun. Anyway, yeah, love me some Uhtred, and I am rewatching The Last Kingdom right now, and I decided to do an episode on what Henry VIII and Elizabeth would have thought about the Vikings if they thought about the Vikings at all, and so that is what we are going to talk about. Before we get started, just a reminder note that Tudorcon tickets are on sale now at the early bird price, englandcast.com/Tudorcon. If you would like to find out more, Tudorcon will be happening in person October 3rd through 5th at Agecroft Hall, again in Richmond. We had so much fun last year there. We're going to go back again this year, and we're going to do it even better. We're going to have an amazing concert on Saturday night with the lutenist Ron McFarlane, who is a friend of the show, and Andrew McAvoy on classical guitar. And they're going to do a concert and talking about the music. That's going to be fun. We're going to have a garden tour of Agecroft this year. And speakers will be announced very soon. We've actually received over 24 really good, solid proposals that we're really excited about, and I actually sent a poll out to the people who have registered already to get their input of the sessions that they want to see. It's going to be really good stuff, you guys, really good stuff. We did sell out last year. We ran out of tickets, so we probably will again this year as well. englandcast.com/Tudorcon to learn more. All right. When the Tudors thought about England's past, their imagination stretched back to the days of Saxon kings, noble warriors, and the looming specter of foreign invaders. But what did they actually know about the Viking period? Unlike today, where the word Viking conjures up images of long ships and horned helmets, which, by the way, they didn't actually wear, the Tudors had a more fragmented, sometimes mythologized understanding of the Norse raiders who had once terrorized England's shores. Much of what the Tudors knew about Viking invasions came from medieval chronicles, texts like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Asser's Life of Alfred, and the later accounts by chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Geoffrey Monmouth. The trouble was these sources weren't exactly written with impartiality. Many of them were composed by monks who had every reason to frame the Vikings as godless barbarians, pillaging churches and burning monasteries. By the time the Tudors got their hands on these accounts, the Vikings had been transformed from historical figures into something closer to cautionary tales, villains in England's story of survival. The two main Tudor historians who helped shape the perception of the past were Polydore Vergil and Raphael Holinshed. Vergil was an Italian historian working in England under Henry VII and Henry VIII, and was more interested in rationalizing England's history rather than simply repeating medieval legends. He largely downplayed Alfred the Great's role, treating him as an effective but not particularly extraordinary king. Holinshed, on the other hand, writing during Elizabeth's reign, leaned into the drama. His Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland painted Alfred as the ultimate warrior ruler, holding the line against Viking hordes. John Foxe, the fiercely Protestant author of the Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, actually took it a step further, depicting Alfred not just as a great king, but a kind of proto-Protestant, defending Christian England from pagan corruption. But how much of this history actually trickled down to the average Tudor? For the nobility and the educated elite, history was a tool, a way to justify power and shape identity. Alfred's story fit neatly into the Tudor narrative of resilience and divine favor, making him useful for legitimizing English kingship. For common people, though, knowledge of the Viking Age likely came less from books and more from oral tradition, folk stories passed down through generations. Place names still carried the echoes of Norse rule, and in some regions there were likely lingering traditions or superstitions tied into the old Viking settlements. So one interesting thing about place names in England is you can tell the places that were under Danelaw or have these Norse connections because of the endings of the names. So endings in by, which for the Scandinavian Vikings, it meant farm or village. So Derby, Whitby, Grimsby. Places ending in Thorpe, which meant outlying farm or small settlement. Scunthorpe, Maplethorpe. Places ending in Toft, which meant homestead or building plot. Langtoft. And finally, places ending in wick or witch, which meant trading place or port. So Berwick, Norwich, Greenwich, Droitwich, all of which were associated with the Danes. So most Tudors wouldn't have consciously recognized these as Norse names, but they definitely would have known that places like Berwick, Whitby, Derby had long histories. And many of these towns or villages retained local traditions tied to Viking settlements. And in places like York, the Norse past was much more visible. So the Tudors might not have thought, oh, yes, this is from Old Norse. But they did know that certain parts of England, especially in the north and the east, where these names are mostly located, would have once been ruled by Scandinavian kings, and they would have known that they were very ancient names. So while the Tudors didn't have any kind of modern understanding of Viking history, they weren't entirely ignorant of it either. What they believed about the Viking Age, however, was often shaped as much by their own political and religious concerns as by historical fact. And nowhere is that more apparent than in how they saw Alfred the Great, a king whose legend was as carefully crafted as any Tudor propaganda. If the Tudors saw the Vikings as brutal but necessary villains in England's rise to greatness, the Normans had a slightly more complicated relationship with them. After all, the Normans are themselves Vikings. They are descended from Norse raiders who had settled in northern France in the early 10th century, and the very name Norman comes from Northmen, a reminder of their Scandinavian roots. For the Norman chroniclers of the 11th and 12th centuries, the Viking period wasn't a story of chaos and invasion. It was part of their own origin myth. William the Conqueror's line could be traced back to Rollo, the Viking chieftain who became the first ruler of Normandy. This meant that while the Normans acknowledged the Viking invasions of England as violent and disruptive, they also had a degree of admiration for the Norse martial prowess and state-building ability. Viking raids were not just acts of destruction, they were just stepping stones towards creating stronger kingdoms like Normandy itself. For the Tudors, though, the story had to be framed a little differently. By the 16th century, England wasn't any longer a land of warring factions and external invasions. It was a rising power, a kingdom that had to be seen as divinely ordained, stable, and uniquely English. That meant positioning England's past as a struggle between true-born English rulers and dangerous outsiders. The Vikings fit neatly into that narrative, serving as a kind of historical prelude to later battles against the Spanish Armada, the French, and even all of Catholic Europe. The big difference between the Norman and Tudor perspectives was who the heroes were. The Normans, with their strong ties to continental Europe, saw England's pre-1066 history as a messy prelude to their own arrival. The Tudors, though, sought to reclaim England's Saxon past as part of their national identity. As Protestantism took hold, the idea that the Norman conquest had brought Catholic corruption gained traction. Some Protestant thinkers even idealized the Anglo-Saxon church as purer and more righteous before the Normans imposed the hierarchical Rome-centered Catholicism that the Tudors were now trying to dismantle. Alfred the Great became an ideal figure in this new historical reimagining. He was the defender of England's ancient liberties, standing against foreign invaders, much as Henry VIII positioned himself against the Pope. The Viking Age was reframed as a moral battle between civilization and barbarism, a convenient lens through which the Tudors could view their own struggles. By the time the Tudors were rewriting England's history, Alfred the Great had already become more myth than man. It's one of those things that sort of blows your mind that Henry VIII is closer in time to us than he was to Alfred, right? We're closer to Henry than Henry was to Alfred. That's kind of like, whew, stop and think about that for a minute. Mind blown. Alfred's story was a legend. It was carefully shaped to fit whatever narrative England's rulers needed, and the Tudors needed him badly. In Hollinshed's Chronicles, Alfred is not just a warrior, he's a savior, almost a biblical king who single-handedly turned the tide against the Vikings. The fact that he was forced into exile before making a triumphant return, an element that was heavily emphasized in the Tudor writings, gave his story an almost Arthurian quality. It fit neatly into England's favorite historical pattern: underdog king, abandoned and persecuted only to rise and reclaim his throne through divine favor. Think about Henry VII having been exiled and then coming back and reclaiming his throne in this massive battle. But one of the best examples of this myth making is the story of Alfred burning the cakes. So, according to legend, while he was in hiding from the Vikings, while he had retreated and was having this time in kind of the wetlands, Alfred took refuge in a peasant woman's home. She asked him to watch some cakes baking on the fire, but he was so lost in thought, plotting England's salvation, of course, that he let them burn. The woman scolded him, not knowing that she was speaking to the king himself. It's a charming little anecdote. They show it in The Last Kingdom, too, in the part where Alfred's hiding out and Uhtred's woman, Iseult, I think it was Iseult, she sees that the cakes are burned and she said, "You had one job, Alfred, you had one job." And he was like, "Well, I guess I'm never going to be a baker." But of course, there's no real evidence that it ever happened. It reads less like a history and more like a Tudor-era morality tale, reinforcing the idea that even kings must learn humility before they can truly rule. But Alfred's real legacy, at least in the Tudor imagination, wasn't just about battlefield victories or kitchen mishaps. It was ruling justly. Tudor writers highlighted his legal reforms, his patronage of learning, and his piety, positioning him as an ideal English king. This was particularly useful for Henry VII, who had spent his life solidifying his own shaky claim to the throne. Alfred was proof that a king didn't need a direct, unbroken line to be legitimate. He needed to be chosen by fate and guided by wisdom. And for Henry VIII and Elizabeth, Alfred served an even more powerful symbol. He was the king who defended England from foreign threats and upheld English independence. The Tudors, locked in battles with the papacy and European Catholic powers, used his story as proof that England had always been a land that resisted foreign domination. The fact that Alfred's greatest enemy was the Great Heathen Army only made the parallel so much more striking. What a better way to frame England's battle with Catholic Spain than as a continuation of Alfred's struggle against the Vikings. Of course, the reality of Alfred's reign was much more complicated. He wasn't just fighting Vikings, he was also making deals with them. The real Alfred negotiated truces, established trade, even allowed Viking rulers like Guthrum to remain in England as long as they converted to Christianity. But the Tudor version of Alfred didn't have room for pragmatism. He had to be an unyielding hero, a forerunner of the Tudor ideal of kingship. By the time the Tudors were shaping England's historical narrative, the Viking invasions, particularly those of the Great Heathen Army of the late 9th century, had become something more than just a military campaign. In Tudor history books, they were an existential crisis, a moment where England's very survival teetered on the edge. The Vikings were cast as a chaotic foreign force bent on destroying England's rightful rulers. The real Great Heathen Army, of course, was a massive Scandinavian invasion force that landed in England in 865, aiming to carve out a permanent Viking kingdom. It was about conquest, not plundering monasteries. Over the next decade, they crushed several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, most notably Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, leaving only Wessex under Alfred the Great still standing, the last kingdom, as it were. But by the Tudor period, the specifics of Viking politics and settlement patterns had been forgotten, leaving room for a more black and white version of events. In Tudor accounts, the Vikings became the ultimate invaders, their ruthlessness exaggerated to emphasize English resilience. They were framed as brutal, merciless plunderers who burned churches, slaughtered monks, terrorized the land. And this wasn't entirely false. Viking raids certainly targeted monasteries. I've actually been to Lindisfarne, which was the first one. I went on that same trip where I went to Bamborough. But the Tudor version was conveniently devoid of any mention of assimilation, trade, or governance in England. Instead, they were just the perfect foils to Alfred's heroism, pure chaos met with divine justice. Holinshed said, "In the year of our Lord 793, the Danes arrived here in England and made sore and lamentable slaughter of the Northumbers at the church of St. Cuthbert in Lindisfarne." Polydore Vergil in 1534 said, "The Danes, a people for those times most skillful in sea matters and desirous of rule, did oftentimes infest the coasts of Britain with their robberies." Much of this framing came from the Protestant Reformation, which was in full swing by the 16th century. The Tudors, particularly Elizabeth, were invested in proving that England had always been a strong, self-sufficient kingdom, resisting the influence of foreign powers, whether that was the papacy, Spain, or the Vikings. That meant that Viking invasions were sometimes presented as a kind of historical foreshadowing. Just as Alfred had fought to preserve England's independence, so too did Henry and Elizabeth. The Spanish Armada, in particular, was sometimes spoken of in the same breath as Viking invasions, an attempt by a mighty foreign force to break England, thwarted by divine intervention and a great English ruler. Even the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled region of England that lasted well into the 10th century, was often glossed over in Tudor histories. Acknowledging that large parts of England had been ruled by Scandinavian kings did not fit the narrative of an unbroken English lineage leading to the Tudors. Instead, the Viking Age was compressed into a story about destruction and recovery, culminating in Alfred's triumph and the restoration of English rule. Another key element in how the Tudors understood the Viking invasions was with religion. The Vikings were pagans, and that made them the perfect villains in a Tudor world that saw history as a divine struggle. Alfred's battles against the Vikings were depicted not just as military victories, but as a war for Christianity itself. In many Tudor accounts, the invaders are described in explicitly demonic terms, agents of destruction sent to test the faith of the English people. This mirrored how the Tudors saw their own struggles against Catholic powers like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. To Protestant England, Rome was an oppressive foreign force just like the Vikings. Some Tudor writers even implied that England's eventual victory over the Vikings was a divine reward for its faithfulness, an early example of England's supposed destiny as a chosen nation. This was a particularly useful story for Elizabeth, who cultivated the image of herself as a divinely anointed ruler standing against foreign threats. Of course, the reality, like everything, was so much more complicated. Many of the Vikings who settled in England converted to Christianity fairly quickly. Some even married into the English aristocracy. The Norse influence in England wasn't just one of destruction. It was also trade and culture and governance with the Danelaw. But with the Tudor retelling, these nuances were stripped away in favor of a cleaner narrative, a pagan enemy defeated by a righteous English king. One of the more interesting aspects of the Tudor perception of the Vikings is how it tied into their larger effort to reclaim England's Anglo-Saxon past. By the 16th century, the Normans were no longer the new rulers of England. They had been replaced by the Plantagenets and now the Tudors. And the Tudor dynasty was a newcomer. Henry VII's claim to the throne was weak, and even Henry VIII and Elizabeth had to cultivate legitimacy. One way to do that was to position themselves as heirs to England's deepest historical roots, not to the Normans, but to the Saxons. During the reign of Henry VIII, some Protestant reformers began romanticizing pre Norman England as kind of a lost golden age, an England that was free from Catholic interference, ruled by just and pious kings like Alfred. The idea was that the Normans had corrupted England, imposing foreign rule and foreign religious practices, and that the Reformation was, in a sense, a return to true English Christianity. This shift in perspective meant that the Viking Age was increasingly framed as the struggle for England's true identity, with Alfred the Great, the last true Saxon king, fighting against outsiders. The Normans had once framed England's pre-1066 history as a time of disarray, with weak kings and constant invasions, justifying their own conquest. But the Tudors flipped the script, portraying the Saxon past as heroic and the Viking invasions as an early failed attempt to wipe out England's rightful rulers. In a way, this was all propaganda, just as much as the Normans had spun their own version of history after 1066. But it was effective propaganda, and Alfred became a symbol of England's eternal resistance, a figure who could be invoked in everything from Protestant sermons to royal pageantry. The Viking invasions, once a messy and complex period of shifting alliances and power struggles, had been transformed into a simple but very powerful story. 1, an existential threat. 2, a righteous king. And 3, a triumphant victory. And in that sense, the Tudors succeeded in something that continues even today, shaping how we remember the past, not necessarily as it was, but how they wanted it to be. While the Tudors mostly viewed Vikings as long-gone raiders, their ties to Scandinavia were far from ancient history. I've done episodes on trade with Iceland that they did, for example. England had ongoing diplomatic, trade, and even marriage negotiations with Denmark and Sweden during the 16th century. These relationships were shaped by political alliances, religious tensions, and even personal ambitions, like the over-the-top courtship of Eric the 14th of Sweden for Elizabeth's hand. The Tudors were, of course, well aware of England's historical ties to Denmark. After all, parts of England had been under the Danish rule for much of the 11th century. The Tudors saw figures like Canute the Great, who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway in the early 11th century, as an important part of the island's past, though their version of events, like we said, downplayed the level of Viking integration into English society. By the 16th century, Denmark remained a major power in Northern Europe, controlling Iceland, Norway, parts of Sweden, and dominating the Baltic trade routes that English merchants relied on for timber and fish and naval supplies. England and Denmark had a complex trading relationship, particularly through the Hanseatic League, which was the network of merchant cities stretching from London to the Baltic. Though Henry VII and Henry VIII often tried to curb the influence of Hanseatic merchants in England, they still relied on Danish timber for shipbuilding, which was crucial as England expanded its navy. The Reformation also helped to play a role in the English relationships with Denmark. Denmark officially adopted Lutheranism in the 1530s, so they became a potential Protestant ally for England after Henry's break with Rome. There were even discussions about a marriage alliance between Henry's children and members of the Danish royal family, though nothing ever came of it. Of all the Scandinavian rulers of the Tudor period, though, none was more fascinated with England than Eric the 14th of Sweden. And we've done episodes on Cecilia Vasa and Helena Snakenborg, who were part of this kind of court that was sent over to woo Elizabeth. Eric was the son of Gustav Vasa. He was ambitious, eccentric, pretty unstable too, who spent years trying to win Elizabeth's hand. From the late 1550s to early 1560s, he bombarded Elizabeth with letters and gifts, hoping to secure an alliance through marriage. He sent envoys to the English court. He offered military support and trade agreements. He even went so far as to commission a portrait of himself dressed in English-style clothing, trying to appeal to Elizabeth's taste. But Elizabeth was never seriously interested. She kept Eric dangling just enough to maintain good diplomatic relations, but had no intention of ever marrying him. Eventually, Eric lost patience and turned his attention elsewhere, but not before making a bit of a spectacle of himself. The Tudors likely saw Eric's pursuit as flattering but impractical. Sweden was a rising power, but was too far removed from English politics to be a meaningful ally. Plus, Eric had a reputation for instability. He later descended into paranoia and violence, ordering the murder of his own noblemen before being deposed and imprisoned, which is not really the kind of man that Elizabeth would have considered for a suitable match. There was a Swedish noblewoman, though, who made her mark at the Tudor court, Helena Snakenborg, and I, of course, did an episode on her a couple of years ago. She was part of this delegation meant to negotiate the marriage between Elizabeth and Eric, but she never returned to Sweden. She stayed and became one of the most prominent Scandinavian figures in Tudor England. She actually also became a close companion of Elizabeth I, serving as one of her senior ladies in waiting. Beyond royal marriages and courtly intrigue, the Tudors also had a practical relationship with Scandinavia, one driven by trade, naval concerns, and the occasional piracy. England relied heavily on Baltic trade for timber, pitch, and masts, which were essential for shipbuilding. Much of this came through Denmark and Sweden. There were also fishing rights for the North Sea and the waters around Iceland. There were hotly contested fishing grounds there, and English merchants frequently clashed with Danish authorities over who had the right to fish there. I would point you to the episode I did on Iceland for that. There was also then privateering and conflict. English ships sometimes raided Scandinavian merchant vessels, especially during times of tension, and Denmark and Sweden both issued complaints about English privateers disrupting their trade. By the 16th century, though, no one in England thought of Denmark or Sweden as Viking nations. The Tudors saw them as powerful but distant kingdoms, occasionally useful as allies, but not central to England's political world. However, like we talked about, there were still remnants of the Viking past in English culture, the place names and traditions, and even some family names that hinted at Norse influence. So while Viking invasions were framed as ancient history, the Tudors still had plenty of real-world connections with Scandinavia. And whether through trade, diplomacy, or royal marriage proposals, they were constantly reminded that England's past and present were tied to the North in ways they couldn't ignore. Of course, this is also the time when England's entering a new era of maritime ambition, one that paralleled Norse seafarers of the centuries before. While Tudors didn't explicitly see themselves as Viking successors, there were undeniable similarities between the expanding naval power of Elizabethan England and the earlier Norse maritime tradition. The Tudors invested heavily in naval expansion, building a fleet that could rival European powers like Spain and France. England was beginning to see itself as a major maritime player, capable of exploring, trading, and, when necessary, engaging in piracy. The seafaring legacy of the Vikings was hard for the Tudors to ignore. Like the Norsemen, the Tudors relied on fast, maneuverable ships and navigated using both practical experience and improving maps. The Vikings had once dominated the North Sea and beyond, and now England was trying to do the same. One of the most Viking-like aspects of Tudor naval policy was privateering, essentially state-sanctioned piracy. Just as Viking longships once raided European coasts, English privateers like Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins targeted Spanish and Portuguese ships, plundering cargo and harassing enemy fleets. Some of the parallels between the Tudor seafarers and Vikings included raiding the enemy ships, establishing trading networks. The Tudors, of course, sought out new markets and routes, much like the Viking merchants had done across the North Sea, and naval warfare tactics. Both the Vikings and the Tudors relied on speed, ambush strategies, and surprise attacks at sea. Even as England built its navy, there was still a lingering fear of invasion, much like the panic caused by the Viking raids centuries earlier. During Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish Armada was the greatest threat to English sovereignty since the Norman conquest. It's unlikely that Elizabethan chroniclers directly compared the Armada to Viking invasions, but there were the same themes present: an enemy fleet approaching England's shores, the need for a strong ruler to defend the realm, and divine interventions, in this case, the infamous storms that scattered the Spanish fleet. England's navy was now its first line of defense, much as Alfred the Great had begun to experiment with naval tactics against the Viking longships. The idea of protecting the coastline from invaders had deep historical roots, and though England now had cannon instead of swords, the fear of foreign ships appearing on the horizon remained very, very real. By the late Tudor period, not all the references were negative. Though the earlier chroniclers had painted them as bloodthirsty raiders, like we talked about, there was a growing fascination with their seafaring skills. For all the emphasis that Tudor chroniclers placed on Alfred the Great as a national hero, his presence in Tudor-era pop culture was surprisingly limited. Unlike figures like King Arthur, who appeared frequently in plays and poems and romances, Alfred's legend remained mostly confined to history books and sermons. However, this doesn't mean he was forgotten. Tudor intellectuals and religious reformers frequently invoked his name, using him as a model of good kingship and defender of the English nation. So, how much of what we know about Alfred the Great and the Viking Age actually comes from the Tudors? A surprising amount. They reframed Alfred as the ultimate English hero, a ruler who stood against foreign invaders. They simplified the Viking invasions into a battle of good versus evil, ignoring the complexities of Viking settlements. They tied England's history to their own political needs, portraying Alfred's reign as the beginning of an unbroken line of strong English rulers. And the Tudor version of history still shapes how we see the Viking Age today. Their nationalist retelling of the past influenced later historians, ensuring that Alfred's legend and the dramatic image of the Viking invasions would endure. The irony, of course, is that while the Tudors cast the Vikings as villains, their own expansionist, naval-driven ambitions had far more in common with those Norse raiders than they would ever admit. So there you go, a little bit on how Henry VIII might have seen Alfred the Great and how the Tudors might have seen stories like The Last Kingdom and Uhtred. So let me know in the comments what you thought about this episode. You can, of course, leave a comment wherever you are listening to this. And remember, Tudorcon tickets at englandcast.com/Tudorcon to learn about that. Let me know what other Viking TV shows and Viking stories and books and stuff you like too. In addition, like I said, I'm totally hooked on The Last Kingdom. But if there's other stuff I should know about too, let me know. All right, my friend, thank you so much for listening, and I will be back again very soon. Have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, a scent will make me sweating. Blow, northern